Um, correct me if I'm wrong. You are more in the bodybuilding side of things a little bit. Would you, to an extent?
Jesus, Mark, please shave that pedo stash. I'm just joshing. What's up, guys? Alec and Enkiri here, and today I want to talk a little bit about Dr. Joel the Troll Seedman and his recent debate with Dr. Mike Israetel of Renaissance Periodization. Dr. Mike and Dr. Joel sat down together on Mark Bell's Power Project this past week and had a chat about Joel's training methods, and it was interesting to say the least. Now, Mike Israetel, Dr. Mike, posed a few really good questions to Joel, and Joel spoke a whole heck of a lot without really answering any of them. Now, as an academic and as a man of science, Mike effectively did his job very well, and to be honest, he kind of made Joel look like an amateur without ever really doing anything. He didn't make any of his own assertions, to be honest. All he really did was pose questions that essentially walked Joel into a corner because Joel couldn't really answer most of the questions effectively. He had no evidence to back up any of his claims besides things like anecdotes like, well, my guy's separated shoulder stopped hurting when we stopped using full range of motion exercises.
Man, if I go even like this much past 90, it hurts. Like, it hurts bad. If I stay right there in that range, it feels totally fine.
Yeah, no shit. He had a torn up shoulder. And now that the acute phase of that injury has passed, maybe you should commence the actual rehabilitation process. And I'll tell you, I'm a fan of the Washington football team. So I have a vested interest in Taylor Heinicke's shoulder health. Okay? Now, at one point, Dr. Joel essentially also asserted that it's better for athletes to prepare their bodies to handle the extreme positions encountered in an uncontrolled environment by practicing their sport and encountering those extreme positions in an uncontrolled environment. You know, kind of as opposed to using strength training to maybe encounter those extreme positions, some of those extreme positions in a controlled and progressive environment.
One of the keys that I always say is, hey, you just got to practice your sport. Okay, that's one of the best ways to keep that sport specificity, that range of motion for that sport. So I'm not saying, hey, don't even practice your sport like that. But in my opinion, one of the best ways to prepare the body for that sport is actually practicing that sport. And if it requires larger range of motion, then when they're practicing that sport, I think they obviously need to get into it. They need to be prepared for it.
This is really kind of a no shit moment right here. And it doesn't really even address what Mike asked. The point was not whether athletes can achieve those extreme joint positions or not. Because if someone is a high level athlete who's been playing a particular sport for many years, then it's just assumed that they can reach many extreme positions that you or that I probably can't reach. But the point that Mike was making is that by gradually increasing the volume of exposure and gradually increasing the intensity of the stimulus in some of those more extreme positions, and thereby increasing the comfort level and of the athlete and increasing the ability of the body to produce force in some of those more extreme positions by exposing yourself to them in a controlled environment, that by doing all that, we can insulate ourselves from injury, both when we encounter some of those extreme positions, as well as just in general, right? Just from generally going about playing your sport and moving through less extreme positions as well. Being more injury resilient through less extreme positions by gradually and progressively training more extreme positions. This is the point that Mike was making, and this is why he brought up knees over toes guy specifically, as best as I can tell, because knees over toes guy is a large advocate for moving the knee joint specifically through their absolute full range of motion and training them to produce high levels of force there through large degrees of flexion, even though he's primarily concerned right with basketball, right, which involves a lot of accelerating and decelerating and jumping, which are not activities that inherently typically involve all that much knee flexion.
Because what I'm saying is that when you do a proper 90-degree position, the muscles are actually very stretched. Biomechanically, it may look, or visually, it may not look that deep, but the muscle fibers themselves are really lengthened because we're creating so much active tension. And
this claim doesn't even make sense. Here, This is the bottom position of one of Joel's squats, the deepest point of his squat. Now, take a close look. How much knee flexion is really present here? How much hip flexion is really present here? How can Joel look at the camera with a straight face and say that the muscle fibers of the quads and the glutes are, quote, really lengthened in this position when the applicable joints here are barely even flexed at all? You're talking maybe 20% at best of the maximum range of joint motion is being utilized here. That means that, by my estimation, approximately 80% is left on the table. Now, if the joints could flex 80% further than this, it would stand to reason that the muscle fibers that are attached to them are not actually very stretched at all when they're in this position, because they do need to be able to stretch a whole hell of a lot further than this before they reach their true cap.
And what we found in unstable training in the research literature is that it fails to produce very high forces. Because of a lack of stability, high force production doesn't occur. So we kind of have this bifurcation in training where if you're going to be unstable, it might as well be in the techniques of your sport. So for example, if Nsima is practicing not getting swept, it's going to be super unstable because it's part of his technique. But when he wants to load his hips and his chest and everything to be stronger for jiu-jitsu, it seems like the specificity principle should dictate that he gets real stable on like a pump or bench press. And then with maximum stability can exert maximum amounts of force. So he's training a high force production in the gym, which is kind of what the gym is supposed to be for. And then, like to your earlier point, the athlete does the athlete stuff and goes through all these ranges of motion and all the stability stuff. So when I see the unstable training that you're doing, my first question is kind of like, if they got more stable, wouldn't their muscles get stronger? And then we could take that new strength and put it into the sport. What do you think about that?
Thank you. Just thank you. Finally, someone else who gets it. I'm so dead freaking tired of these performance experts who hide behind stability training simply because they don't understand the actual role of strength and conditioning. They don't understand the actual role of sport-specific training. And point blank, they simply don't know how to get people strong.
What do you think about that?
Those are great questions. First off, you're analyzing it way deeper and more, scientifically than most people do. So I like that, because oftentimes people just like ask the questions like, "Dude, are you even thinking about how you're phrasing it?" So I like that. I think so.
Someone's flustered. 24 minutes, and honestly, Joel never really said anything at all. And what he did say didn't really pack much of a wallop behind it. He just kept backing up and backing up and backing up until Mike had him against the ropes. And frankly, it's hard to cite your own research in a situation like this and expect to actually be taken seriously. So at least Joel had the good sense not to do that. But I do have a feeling that from here on out, he'll be sticking mostly to Instagram posts. But I digress. I would encourage all of you guys to go watch the debate in its entirety so that you can come to your own conclusions about it. And I'll link it below in the description for those who are interested in doing so. Also, new drinking game. Take a shot every time Joel uses the word inflammation.
Inflammatory response, a lot of inflammation. They're not inflamed. The inflammatory response, they're not inflamed. The inflammatory response, they're not inflamed. The inflammatory response,
Like, seriously, dude, if your guys' joints are so inflamed all the time, maybe you need to reanalyze your loading and your volume protocols before you start chopping the range of motion of exercises in half. Because it sounds more like faulty programming to me than the fault of the exercises themselves. Now, before this drags on for too long, I really want to touch on one smaller segment of this whole debate that's probably going to get drowned out in the noise here surrounding all of this, because frankly, Joel embarrassed himself here, and that's mostly what people seem to be focusing on. But, this is important. Towards the end of the debate, Joel basically admitted that his entire Instagram page is essentially one big, gigantic marketing farce.
So one of the things I always say, and I need to do a better job of this on Instagram, is 80% of everything I have my athletes do, everything that I do, it focuses on the foundational movements. When I post exercises, I do intentionally oftentimes go after exercises that are a little bit more eye-catching, because I know that for me to reach the most population, the largest portion of the audience, if I just posted deadlift, squat, bench, and even though we do a lot of those, and that makes up a stronger majority of my training than just unstable versions, I'd probably get a quarter of the people looking at my things. My reach, it would be less.
I totally understand. Yeah, having a big following is important. I have a tiny following and I live alone and I'm addicted to masturbation.
Now, see, this is the part that truly irks me. Let's assume that what Joel is saying is true here, that 80% of what he does and what he has his athletes do is the basics, as he called them, the foundational movements, right? And that the other 20% of what they do is the wacky and silly and ludicrous shit that his Instagram page is rife with. Now, if you visited his Instagram page, you would think that this was the only thing that he had his athletes do, because this is the only thing that's ever demonstrated there. So now, and I see this exact sentiment echoed in comments across social media, and it bugs me. So now, if you're a layman, or you're just a guy who's unfamiliar with sport performance training, or whatever, you come in, you see Joel's page, right? You see him training a few NFL athletes, and you see all this bizarro world type shit, this bizarro world flashy type of shit, and you think, oh, okay, well, this is how you train for athletic performance, right? They're training to be better athletes. They're not training for muscular hypertrophy. They're not training for strength. This is performance training. And it's this big mystical thing with all these mystical auras surrounding it, right? And so this guy with 400,000 followers, he's just an innovator. Now, like I said, let's assume that Joel is telling the truth here, that this stuff makes up just 20% of his training, right? So then logically, we have to ask, and if I recall correctly, Dr. Mike did ask, why then is it representative of 100% of your content if it only makes up 20% of your training methods? And the answer to that question is obvious. But the problem with this misrepresentation is that it creates a false narrative. It creates a false narrative that this is just how you guys train pretty much all the time, right? It's not with the basics, because the basics are not demonstrated or represented here at all. It's just this bizarro world type shit that is shown. So that's the impression that you're giving to people who don't have a full understanding of what this sort of thing entails. And in my opinion, not only does that do a disservice to the industry and make a mockery of the profession itself, but it's also, as Joel now freely admits, simply just a lie. It is a lie for the purposes of marketing and building a following. And I know I've touched on this idea before in some of my past videos on Dr. Joel the Troll, but my question has to be, and my question is always going to be, why? If you have NFL athletes and you have professional athletes coming to you, you own your own training facility, you should be making plenty of cash. Revenue should not be a problem. And if NFL athletes want to waste their money on you, then that's their prerogative. It's a shame, because they probably just don't know any better, and they could potentially perform at a higher level on the playing field, but that's not really the bigger sin. In my opinion, the bigger sin is creating this false portrait, this false narrative that you freely and publicly admit now is all simply done solely for the sake of attention, to build a bigger following with lay people who don't know any better, so that you can misdirect them and sell them your flashy and gimmicky training methods that make up only 20% of what you do anyway. That's the real sin here. That's the sad part. That's the part that makes Joel the Troll a really, truly, and grimy snake oil salesman. A professional athlete is going to be physically gifted because they were born physically gifted, but what Joel is selling lay people is largely not going to help them advance their level of physical fitness. He's literally taking people's money while simultaneously holding them back. He's duping people because he didn't believe that he could stand out well and good enough of his own accord without resorting to gimmicks. And he's doing it solely for the sake of greed, because he already trains professional athletes. He shouldn't need the money. He shouldn't need a massive social media presence to be making money. And that's just shitty, man. It just bugs me, because you're steering people in the wrong direction. You're continually making a mockery of performance training, and you're making people believe that there's some kind of fundamental difference between training for strength as it pertains to, say, a strength sport versus training for strength and hypertrophy in a way that's valid for athletics and sports. But strength is is strength, and the methods for acquiring it are largely universal. And the more range of motion that you can train through, the more range of motion that your muscles and joints have, and the more strength and power that they can produce in those deep end ranges, the better. Life is chaotic. Sport is chaotic. And the best way to be prepared for chaos is to encounter it in a progressive environment that you can control, rather than avoid it at all costs until it smacks you in the fucking face one day. The moral of the story is, don't listen to a damn word that Joel puts out on social media. Not only is it counterintuitive, but how he truly trains his clients when the cameras turn off is something that we'll never know, unless someone in my audience hires him as their coach. But the fact of the matter is, he's now admitted that what he posts on social media is literally done strictly for the sake of gaining attention and building a larger following. Now that is the literal definition of a gimmick. It doesn't have anything to do with how he actually trains people or how he believes that people should actually train. And as far as I'm concerned, that makes the entirety of the advice that he publicly doles out void of any consideration. And if you're a fan of Dr. Joel, I would encourage you to do a deeper dive into the widespread practices and theories of the industry, both in terms of people who lean more towards the strength and hypertrophy spectrum, and separately those who lean more towards the performance end of the spectrum. And then find the commonalities there. See what methods are largely accepted and replicated in a widespread fashion across the industry, and then revisit Joel's page with a more discerning eye on your second viewing. I'll leave you with an analogy. There are certain types of brain surgery that require you to be awake during parts of the procedure in order to ensure that the neurosurgeon doesn't damage vital portions of the brain. The patient is given simple tasks to complete during the surgery, such as counting, talking, and looking at pictures. And this is the commonly accepted practice for these types of brain surgery. Now, let's assume that I need brain surgery, and I consult 100 neurosurgeons, and 99 of them tell me that it would be best for me to remain awake during my operation. But just one of them says I could be knocked out for the whole thing because that's going to help me feel better about things. Now, do you think that I should listen to the 99 surgeons who say that I need to be awake, or the one who says that I can be asleep the whole time because that's going to help me to feel better about things? And then lo and behold, I wake up with fucking brain damage and I can't make YouTube videos anymore. The point is, just because something feels better in the moment doesn't necessarily make it the best or most optimal course of action for the long run. 99 out of 100 fitness industry professionals recommend lifting through a full range of motion. Joel Seedman is the 1 out of 100, and it ain't brain surgery, guys. Anyway, that's all I got for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, I hope that you were able to take something useful away from it. Please remember to smash the like button before you go. Leave me some love in the comments, subscribe to my channel, share the video, all that jazz. And if you're interested in online coaching or training programs, then be sure to visit my website, www.enkirielitefitness.com, for more details. Keep training hard, and I will catch you guys next time.